Good evening and welcome to Economics Unbound. Tonight we discuss the transport economics of South Africa. We talk taxis, trains, buses and aircraft. We unpack the dynamics and the amounts of money involved in moving this economy, its people and its goods from port to inland, from work to school and from pillar to post. You know, Nana, in this country, we hail taxis in a very unique way. We sign 2 fingers up, 3 fingers down, depending on where I'm going. Now, if I'm going to Bree Street in Johannesburg, this is what I do as I sign. If I'm going for a COVID test at Baragwanath Hospital, that's how I sign. If I'm going north, whichever way north, it depends where I'm starting my journey from. I can use any number of the fingers on my hand. For example, if I'm going to Lenasia, which is where my producer Prudence Makubalo comes from, that is what I do. Good evening, everyone. I'm Tandeka Kubulembek.
Good evening. You sound like it's all fun and games, and yet it's not. There have been much song and dance and protest and fury regarding the condition and nature of public transport in South Africa. Entering the COVID-19 pandemic, the transport economy's performance had declined by 0.4% in the first quarter of 2020 compared to the fourth quarter of 2019. But before we talk economics, here's a clip about how we signed for one of the 250,000 taxis on the streets of Mzansi.
With millions of South Africans using taxis every day, taxi signs have become a fundamental way to communicate with taxi drivers about where you're going. Soweto is one of the many places in Gauteng where commuters use signs to go wherever they want to go.
When I come to school, I use the sign, that means it's via Para. Okay. Then when I go back home, I use the sign 3, which means it goes via T Junction next station 3.
Okay, thank you. And let's not forget the weird signs while waiting for a taxi, from showing a fist, index finger pointing down, and even this.
The sign was like this. It means crossroad.
Okay. As a commuter, it's always best to familiarize yourself with taxi lingo. Short left, short right, or stop sign. But remember, just don't say donkey driver.
Different methods of transport in South Africa include roads, railways, airports, water and pipelines for petroleum oil. The majority of people in South Africa use informal minibus taxis as their main mode of transport. BRT has been implemented in some South African cities in an attempt to provide more formalized and safer public transport services. These systems have been widely criticized due to their large capital and operating costs. A freeway is different from most countries as certain things are forbidden, which include certain motorcycles, no hand signals and motor tricycles. South Africa has many major ports including Cape Town, Durban and Port Elizabeth that allows ships and other boats to pass through, some carrying passengers and some carrying petroleum tankers. The Department of Transport is responsible for the legislation and policies for rail, pipelines, roads, airports, harbours and the intermodal operations of public transport and freight. It is responsible for conducting sector research, formulating legislation and policy to set the strategic directions of subsectors, assigning responsibilities to public entities, regulating through setting norms and standards. In 2013 National Households Travel Survey, findings obtained revealed that 68.8% of South African households use taxi services daily, followed by the commuter bus of 21.1% and the commuter rail operations at 9.9%. Despite the available modes of transportation, South African transport is still plagued with several challenges. These comprise of low ridership, lack of public transport accessibility in rural areas, equity imbalances and congestion. The South African public transport industry is currently under immense inquiry as captive users as these systems face unsafe, unreliable and costly systems. The transport strategies implemented is that government has committed to providing South Africans with safe, accessible public transport. This has been emphasized at the national, provincial and municipal level as an aspect that requires immediate attention, and it is important to analyze some of the strategies that will be implemented in years to come.
Thank you, Prudy, for all of that. But, you know, rail is king. It is also my favorite form of transport, you know. And most of South Africans, a bulk of them, in fact, in certain areas like the Western Cape, prefer rail as a mode of transport. But this sector has had its own fair share of troubles during and before the COVID-19 crisis.
In fact, rail transport is the backbone of many economies because of its capacity to transport large volumes of people and goods affordably. The IMF argues that given the proximity gap in Africa, a reduction in ground transport costs is especially critical to encouraging intra-regional trade here at home and on the continent.
Earlier this month, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced that minibus taxis will now be allowed to run at 100% capacity. And appears to be a demonstration, and this appears to be a demonstration perhaps of the relative weakness of the state vis-à-vis the power of the mass transport industry. Let's listen more up on this clip.
Taxis undertaking long trips will have to adhere to a 70% occupancy. But those who are undertaking local trips will be permitted to increase their capacity to 100%. And this will be on condition that new risk mitigation protocols related to masks, vehicle sanitation, and open windows are followed.
As a taxi driver, I can say the prices have increased, but the challenge is that many people have lost their jobs. So it means even when the prices is increased, but there's no people who are using the transport.
The taxi is high, but most of the people, they are no longer working. We lose our jobs. Above that, the taxi is still full. So we don't even know what is the reason for taxi is full now. The petrol is still the same. You understand? So why is the taxi is full and the money for the tax fare is high? So we don't know how they are doing their maths.
And now we prepare for an interview with Mr. Paul Browning, who is a transport economist. Good evening, Paul Browning. How are you?
Good evening. I'm very well, thank you.
Now, the transport economics of South Africa follow the pattern of the general economy: high levels of inequality, loads of informal modes of transport, and a poor public transport sector. What would you say we can do to reset these dynamics?
That is a very simple question to a very complex subject. For 25 years or so, since the democratic elections of 1994, government has been trying to develop plans for integrated public transport. The general idea is that the local authority will plan an integrated network within its area that meets the needs of the local population, and it will then contract the provision of those services to transport operators, who include, by the way, taxis. That was introduced in a white paper, as it happens, in 1996. But really, we have seen very, very little implementation since then. And the reasons I assume we might want to talk about.
Yes, couldn't the reasons possibly relate to the failures of local government in general, the failures in planning, the failures in delivery of basic services, and the inability to give effect to public policy?
You're quite right, and this has been recognized by the Department of Transport, which has begun to scale back the grander plans. There seem to be the essential problem is that the local authorities, very few of the local authorities, even at metropolitan level, very few of them have either the capability to plan, and because of that, they have limited ability to implement these complex public transport sector networks. And so although there have been one or two small efforts, like you mentioned bus rapid transit in some cities, one or two lines and so on, there's, other than that, there has been very little in the way of integrated transport.
Now, given that we've seen so much failure, especially financial management and governance failures at the local area, to give over such an important sector such as transport to these failing local authorities, which is advocated in the ANC's latest economic proposition that they're going to implement a policy of hyper-localization. How can we localize on the back of failing municipal governance?
The Department of Transport, in the case of public transport anyway, has developed a policy which it is itself implementing slowly, that the authorities which are finding the greatest difficulty will be given help from specialists in various categories and so on. Now, whether that will be adequate is difficult to see. It's one thing to have assistance in developing a plan that may be useful, but implementing it, that really does have to be done at local level. And the question that must be asked is, are we aiming too high? It would be wonderful to have fully integrated public transport systems in a city like Joburg or Cape Town or Nelson Mandela Bay. It would be wonderful, and especially if there was just a single ticket which you could use on any mode of transport, but we may simply be aiming too high.
Now, let's talk about COVID and the transport sector. There's been a huge contraction, something in the region of 4.5%. Now, with the shutdown of schools that the President talked about this evening, that's going to be even more, there's going to be even more of a contraction as transportation of the students throughout the country comes to a grinding halt.
You're quite right. COVID has affected transport, public transport in particular, in the same way that it has affected so many other parts of our economy. It has not exactly ground to a halt, but it has certainly slowed down very, very substantially, and we are only just beginning now to see the easing of lockdown. So it has affected transport. I gather that Gautrain, for example, here in Gauteng, is carrying something like 15% at the most of the peak hour passengers that it was carrying before the lockdown. And so buses will have the same difficulty. And as I think was hinted in one of your interviews just a few moments ago with the taxi operator, the taxis also are finding that there are simply, even if they can load to 100%, there simply aren't the number of passengers that there were around before the lockdown, before COVID came along.
Now, talking about taxis and buses during this period, have we been innovative enough in having a very nuanced response and stimulus? Couldn't we have suspended things like the fuel levy and played around with that in order to create extra soft landings for perhaps taxis and other forms of transport on which we as citizens are highly dependent?
Yes, there are always these options, and government has to select what seems appropriate at the time, given the enormous financial constraints, or rather the enormous financial demands on them. And when in due course the inquiry takes place into what we did during COVID-19, I'm sure that there'll be many suggestions that in fact government should have done this perhaps, or it should have done that. It will be easy to be wise after the event, all right, we're not after the event now, but yes, easing the fuel levy would have been one thing. Government has taken steps to assist, to try and assist public transport. For example, it's offered more than 1.1 billion rands to the taxi industry in the way of a COVID-19 relief fund. That has been rejected as being inadequate. So government is trying, but it is stretched in every possible direction.
Are we stretched also in terms of our ability to innovate? Paul, can you hear me? I'm sorry, we seem to have lost the line to Mr. Paul Browning. Thank you very much for this discussion, Paul Browning. Let's take a short break.
Now, let us give you an array of packages that Tandega will introduce. This is all to set the scene for you in terms of the array of forms of transportation available to South Africans and that have a massive impact on our economy.
The airline industry has expressed cautious optimism over the resumption of flights and the reopening of more airports. The industry took a knock financially, as you can imagine, when lockdown came into effect 3 months ago. Although the sector has been observing COVID-19 regulations, some passengers are calling for more social distancing on flights.
The airline industry was ground to a halt amid the hard lockdown, which resulted in massive financial losses. According to estimates from the International Air Transport Association, local airlines lost about 55 billion rand. Although airlines have resumed flying for essential domestic travel and business purposes, ticket sales remain depressed. FlySafair says it has been operating at 20% capacity and looks forward to more airports opening up.
The industry at large is still in a very, very tough position. I mean, I think if we survey the landscape, there are a number of players who are still not operating. And of course, during that process are enduring losses, whether it be through financing costs, aircraft leases, facility leases, even salaries. So, these are realities that are being faced across the industry at large. And as I said, given that we're operating between 6 to 8% as an industry of what we had this time last year, that just gives you a sense of how severe that is from an industry perspective.
Flights resumed when government announced the easing of regulations to lockdown level 3, but flying amid the COVID-19 pandemic has required greater cooperation between Airport Company South Africa and the South African Civil Aviation Authority to ensure passenger and crew safety.
We're also sanitizing the aircraft very, very deeply. So we use a process of, in between flights, we actually have an aerosol-based sanitizer that we use to fog the cabins entirely between actual loads. And then in the evenings, we use very sophisticated electrostatic sprayers, which deliver a great substance which has actually got an extended dwell time, which means it remains active on surfaces for an extended period. And that electrostatic nature allows the particles to cling into all different parts of the aircraft. So that really just creates like a super, super sterile environment to get started with.
Government regulations allow airlines to fly at 100% capacity, with the exception of a few rows being reserved for self-isolation purposes. Passengers who want distance and space in flight have the option of paying an additional fee, which varies from airline to airline. But there are some passengers who want the industry to do more to allow for more social distancing in flight.
I'm constantly on the plane, so it was rather nerve-wracking to be back on a flight again after 120 days. So I was a bit, I was nervous, but not so nervous. But I was nervous on a couple of things. One is the nervousness of not knowing that there's a complete new way of flying. I'm used to just grabbing my bags and just flying. But now there are forms to complete, medicals to ensure that you're healthy. So there's a lot of compliance other than just the aviation compliance themselves.
The wearing of masks is compulsory in flights. Furthermore, passengers and crew members are required to sanitize and observe COVID-19 regulations. Mbalenhle Mthethwa, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Metrorail in the Western Cape started trial runs with limited operations in Cape Town this morning. It's a way to gauge operational plans and compliance with COVID-19 regulations. The rail company welcomed its first passengers back online, returning from retreat to the CBD of Cape Town earlier this month.
After a forced shutdown of 13 consecutive weeks, Metro Rail is getting back on track. Trains are a lifeline for tens of thousands of people as the cheapest way to travel.
If this is going to happen and it's working and the train doesn't get delayed at Salt River for signals and God knows what else, then I think then I'm a very, very happy commuter of Metro Rail. So let's hope and pray. I mean, we all need a bit of good news in these times.
Clear demarcations for distancing, sanitizing and screening. Passengers are advised to arrive earlier than normal to go through the process.
Only 70 people on ride at the station. Social distance are very important. Please keep your distance between the people.
Only 30 to 50% passenger capacity is allowed and trains are disinfected on its return journey.
We have done the best preparation to protect you and your family. Moving forward, it is now up to you to take personal responsibility, to follow all the guidelines that were put inside the stations in terms of social distancing and inside the trains themselves.
For years, rail services in Cape Town have been riddled with crime, vandalism and arson. Train sets have dwindled from 88 to little more than 30. Especially the main line through the Cape Flats is affected. Combined with the COVID-19 shutdown, commuters were forced to travel by road, adding pressure on an already congested system. The Department of Transport is pleased with the plan presented by PRASA and hopes it will have results when operations are at full capacity again.
Our economy is on its knees. We don't have money in South Africa. In fact, my concern is that we will now be cutting, maintenance budget in order to supplement, and do other things, and like fighting COVID. And when you do that, you end up with a situation that we have at Eskom. And striking that balance becomes very, very difficult, but necessary, because you cannot, cut maintenance, budget completely. And that is what is likely to happen. And that is why fixing trains becomes critical.
Mariska Botha, SABC News, Cape Town.
But Thandeka, what is in the mind of our cabinet? What is on the table and what are we thinking? Cabinet is juggling policy options. What are these? National Treasury and the Transport Ministry are inherently intertwined in formulating a transport policy to maximize the transport economy's potential.
To talk more on the taxi industry and the transport industry in general, I'm joined by the Department of Transport spokesperson from KwaZulu-Natal, and his name is Kwanele Ngalane. Good evening, Kwanele. Welcome to Economics Unbound.
Good evening and evening to all the SABC viewers at home.
Now, you've been following our discussion, and particularly our discussion tonight, about the economics of the South African transport system. What is in the mind of the department? What's up there at the top of your to-do list?
Well, firstly, we do acknowledge the fact that the spread of the coronavirus has brought about some challenges in the taxi industry, especially as one of the black-run business. We understand that they've been mostly affected, and that is why we appreciate and welcome the measures that have been taken by government from the minister to intervene in terms of trying to assist the taxi industry to access some relief, but also making sure that the safety of the commuters is not compromised. Importantly is to make sure that we do not allow the industry to become the commuter of the disease. That is why there's been measures that have been put in place, starting previously with the decision of the 70%, the use of masks, the sanitization, especially in this province. We've had numerous engagements with the taxi industry where the MEC, together with the local leadership, has been engaged with Santaco and associations in the province, where we've been sanitizing taxi ranks, where we've been making sure that all necessary safety measures and precautions are taken into place.
Beyond Kwanele, beyond firefighting and discussing the details of taxi hygiene and taxi ranks, what is on the policy agenda high up there? What's in the mind of Cabinet, and what proposals is the Ministry of Transport putting on the table of Cabinet to alleviate? And frankly, the relationship between the Transport Ministry and the taxi industry looks like a bomb about to happen, or a crisis deferred at this stage.
Well, you'll appreciate the fact that at the national level, the minister has been on record talking about the work that the government is doing in terms of exploring issues of subsidizing the taxi industry and other economic intervention to make sure that in the long term we are able to build a viable, transformed industry that will have meaning in terms of economy, in terms of beneficiation as well. But however, those discussions are still ongoing at the national level. We do make our own contributions as provinces in that regard, and we concur that we need to review the structure of the industry in its current form and make it more viable, because you know what is happening currently is that we have got an industry that is oversaturated. And as we have got an industry that is oversaturated, owners are not making money unless they've got more than 3, more than 5 vehicles.
Yes,
so
and the dynamics of competition in that industry are rather toxic, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. These are some of the things where we are making interventions to say, how do we build an industry where everybody has got equal access, where there are equal opportunities, and where everybody will be able to benefit. So those are discussions that are on the table. But obviously, as the province as well, we are constantly engaged with the industry. In fact, over the past 3 years, we've had the provincial taxi in Davos, where we've engaged with the leadership of the taxi industry and the membership, discussing some of the policy issues and policy interventions where we think we can best transform the industry. But we have said to them, we first need to deal with the issue of regulating the industry. We must root out all those operators and operations that are run illegally. We must root out issues of violence. We must root out the issues of hitmen. We must root out the illegal collection of monies which are used randomly to do all nefarious activities in the industry. So we are moving towards the professionalization of the industry, which we think is going to be the backdrop of the success of the industry.
Now, Kwanele, beyond the taxi industry and our current preoccupation with the dynamics in the taxi industry, what about the resetting of the dynamics of the total transport economy? Because this is a sector upon which many other, in fact, all other sectors depend, because we depend on you guys to get us to work and to school and for this economy to function.
Well, we agree that at the primary level there has to be integration in terms of how the modes of transport are operating. They must complement one another, and that is why government over years has introduced what is called intermodal facilities, where even the land transport itself, we're trying to achieve a scenario where they are all in one area, where commuters can access a taxi, can access a bus, can access a train, so that we create a hub for public transport and move away from this silo mentality where there was unnecessary competition, where there was a conflict among various modes of public transport. So that was a stepping stone towards integrating the operations in the taxi industry. And we agree that there must be a feeder to the main operations as well, such as the airlines, to the airport, and other forms of public transport. So these are issues that we assist with, and we're quite sure that at the pace at which we are moving, guided by the leadership of MEC Pegintulu and the Premier of KwaZulu-Natal in the province, we are able to make our meaningful contribution to national and to the minister, so that we are able as a country to have an integrated approach when it comes to public transport.
Now, Kwanele, would you tell the minister that Nana and I would like to get into a tram from Melville to Auckland Park, the SABC, when COVID lifts? Thank you very much for joining us from KwaZulu-Natal tonight. And now joining us on the line, we have Gareth Taylor, and he's the country manager of Bolt South Africa. Good evening, Gareth. How are you? Here I am standing in front of you. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. Your take on the dynamics of the transport industry, which mirror our dynamics of inequality in the country. Any bright thoughts on what we can do to reset these dynamics post-COVID, and what we can do to alleviate the plight of public transport operators during the pandemic? How can we make the stimulus speak to them?
Sure. It's like trying to solve world peace there. I think this is a problem to be solving at the moment. You know, as we know, when less people are moving around, there's less business for those who are transporting them around. So this is a really, really difficult situation that transport operators are finding themselves in at the moment. We've been doing a number of things on the Bolt side from an e-hailing perspective, so I can speak to that. But as an overall industry, this is definitely a difficult space that we're finding ourselves in at the moment.
What's happening in the e-hailing space?
So we've done a couple of things over the last couple of months. We've launched an isolated category, which has a physical barrier between the passenger and the driver. This limits the spread of water droplets and the spread of airflow between the two. This then is limiting the transmission of the virus between passengers and drivers.
Let me get this, water droplets, you mean the sort of potential COVID droplets?
Yeah, so a lot of the research comes from, water vapor or from saliva, so or from when you're breathing as well. So based on that, what we've then done is installed in over 3,500 vehicles a plastic screen that then separates between the driver and the passenger. So when the passengers are sitting in the back seat, they can feel safer, and the driver then in the front is less at risk. And yeah, as I mentioned, we've fitted this in over 3,500 vehicles now. And do you have spraying gadgets? I've seen some very innovative full-body spraying gadgets lately. So when we've spoken to the NICD and had a look at best practice internationally, what they recommended is that spraying actually isn't best practice and doesn't actually help that much. The best thing to do is actually to be sanitizing our hands. So part of the practice for passengers before getting into a vehicle and after getting out of the vehicle is to sanitize their hands. All passengers and drivers have to have a mask when coming into the vehicles. The windows need to be 5 centimeters open on the sides as well. We in Gauteng, Joburg, and Cape Town, we issue the drivers with free hand and surface sanitizer, so that they're able to be sanitizing their hands as well as the surfaces, the high-touch surfaces, which is required between trips as well. And do your drivers offer sanitizer to the passengers as well? Yes. Yes, so that's part of the process of us being able to issue the drivers with that sanitizer liquid. We know that times are tough, so that's what we're doing. We're issuing it to them at no charge from those 3 driver centers that we have. And no mask, no ride? That's correct. Yes, so from a passenger perspective, you're not allowed to get in a car without a mask on. Or once they're in the car, they have to keep their mask on. The latest regulations that have been passed this week actually passes the obligations onto the operators, and that's transport operators across the board, that they're not allowed to let any passengers get into their vehicle without a mask on. Otherwise, they face a fine or imprisonment as well. And then very definitely the drivers need to have a mask on them as well in order to be operating. Now, back to economics. We've seen a vicious battle between yourselves and the traditional meter taxis over the past few years. And that's been quite a vicious battle of technology and price versus the old model of taxis. How has that been resolved, if at all? So one of the things in engaging with some of the associations is to say, there's nothing stopping meter taxis from coming onto e-hailing platforms. In many of the other countries throughout the world, taxis actually have come onto e-hailing platforms and offer their services there. And in this way, they're able to make sure that they're able to compete on the same playing field. So yeah, unfortunately, discussions haven't gone and haven't been very fruitful in that regard. That said, our commitment is to carry on providing great earnings opportunities for drivers to be able to earn a decent living, and for passengers to have a really affordable way to be able to get from A to B. And a safe ride? Yes, absolutely. I mean, we have a number of initiatives that are in place there. Every driver that comes onto the platform, they need to have a professional driver's permit, which requires a police clearance certificate. In addition to that, there's a criminal background check that is required that we do on top of the police clearance certificate, because we found that some people manage to get that license even though they have a criminal background. There is also a 45-point inspection that's required on each vehicle before it comes onto the platform, as well as a double disc, which is required to carry fare-paying passengers. And in order to get that, you need to have a roadworthy as well for the vehicle. So safety is really, really important to us. And there's a number of initiatives that we have been doing as well, just on the technology front, to be able to make it more and more safe for the drivers and passengers
now,
who use them.
Back to the economics, how many e-hailing cars are there on South African roads? And how big is the sector? And have you ever sought government mediation or intervention for some of the commercial conflicts that you've had with other sectors of the transport industry?
So by our best estimates, about 2% of all trips that happen in urban centres are used via e-hailing. So I think the best estimates are about 70% with minibus taxis, for example. So it's a fair percentage. Based on trends, that could get up to 20-25% over the next 10 years. So an incredible opportunity for business creation in South Africa. At the moment, for Bolt, we have over 10,000 drivers who are on the platform with us. I think some of the other big platforms have similar numbers that they publish.
Now, when it comes to your recommendations as part of the public transport sector to the government, what do you advise about improving the dynamics of this economy?
So I think what we need to be always focusing on, and this is in the engagement that we've had with the Competition Commission, which resonates with principles that they hold to, is making sure that there is a service that provides a decent earnings for drivers and operators so that they're able to earn well. And in addition to that, being able to provide the most affordable transport possible for users. And part of that commitment, actually just this last week, we launched a low-cost category called Go, which is at about 20-25% cheaper than the normal category that is then seeking to provide additional earnings for the drivers, as well as for a more affordable way of transport and travel for passengers and commuters.
And finally, wouldn't you say that if the government got its act together and provided truly modern, efficient, clean and affordable public transport to South African citizens, that would blow you and your business model out of the water?
I think that some of the principles that government is putting together is the fact of public-private partnerships. And we found working with the government actually really rewarding in the last couple of years in terms of their engagement with us and being able to collaborate. So I think, firstly, there's a number of really great initiatives that government has been doing. Yes, our transport sector isn't as effective and efficient as it could be, where people don't know when a taxi is going to be there or when the bus is going to be there. And it does certainly leave opportunities for platforms like ourselves, where individuals need to be relying on a more reliable transport. But I don't think it's an either or. I think more so it is a both and. How can we be collaborating together to bring our best technology and best practice from a global perspective with what government is trying to provide for commuters throughout South Africa to bring best practice and the best possible experience for commuters?
Now, a bit tongue-in-cheek, when are you going to consider some virtual and e-hand signs, just like the taxis have, for e-hailing your taxis?
I love that. Thank you.
Well, that's all we have for tonight.
But thanks, I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. That's all we have for tonight. Let's take a good break. Welcome back. The University of Pretoria and the Council for Scientific Research, the CSIR, an entity of the Department of Science and Innovation, DSI, have signed a memorandum of agreement to collaborate in the area of smart transport, cities and environments. Now, Professor Wynand Steyn, head of the Department of Civil Engineering in the University of Pretoria's Faculty of Engineering, Built Environments and Information Technology, joins us now to discuss further. Welcome, Professor.
Very much, appreciate it.
Now, you're involved in the building and the construction of roads, and so you have a bird's eye view of what's needed to be done to improve the public transport dispensation that South African citizens have.
Yes, quite true. Major interest, research interest and education interest of myself looking at how road infrastructure specifically affect the vehicles that travel on the road, but also the goods and the people that travel on that road. Because the better the road, the better the trip. And if you've got conditions that's not optimal, then obviously whatever you transport is going to be affected by those conditions.
Now, is it true that failures in rail in recent years have caused goods to be transported on our roads, particularly commercial goods headed for our ports, and this has created enormous pressure on South African roads? How can the situation be remedied?
That is one of the reasons for the mass transportation of goods on our roads. There are various other ones, some of them just being plain logistics, because it's sometimes easier to get a truck to your farm to load your produce and to get it to a specific market. But the main issues that one has to look at is maintenance, because both on the rail side as well as on the road side, the better your maintenance, the better the life of that facility is going to be, and the longer you are going to get good service from the facility. And the reason that we have to do the maintenance is not necessarily because we have not designed or constructed it well. Any infrastructure that you use requires maintenance. And one of the major things in terms of a smart transportation, smart infrastructure environment is that we live in an era where the sensors that can monitor or measure the condition of our roads and rail has developed tremendously. It's becoming much cheaper, much better to work, and it provides us with a lot of good data to understand what's going on.
Now, Professor, the Department of Transport is considering these mass public transport hubs, as you heard Gwanele tell us from the Department of Transport. Would this alleviate some of the pressures that you are seeing from your angle of the transport industry, or would it just worsen these?
It will have an effect, and it depends on what part of the transport one is looking. It's important to understand that in terms of damage to roads over time, that's more the real heavy type of vehicles. If we look at mass transport, public transport type of hubs, that's an effect that more looks after congestion and the time to travel and how quickly it actually takes you to get to your destination. So for sure, it is addressing one of the aspects of the whole transportation question that we are sitting with.
Now, Professor, we're a show that's primarily concerned with public policy issues in economics. And I assume that you have been having chats with people at the Department of Transport about policy matters and about the issue of what can be done to improve the dispensation in public transport. What are you talking about, and what is your sense of the future?
There are various discussions ongoing. And I think it's important to also appreciate that from a university viewpoint, from a research organization viewpoint, the main input that can be provided is good current research in terms of the conditions in South Africa on our roads, and then to understand and provide the guidance in such a way that one balances it. Because on the one hand, we've got the big metropolitan areas where you've got a lot of congestion, you've got a lot of vehicles, but we've also got a major rural road network in the country.
But when you talk to the department, what do you talk about?
We try to provide them with the information that we gain from research, for instance, in terms of better materials to construct a road with and to maintain that road with so that they can get a longer life out of the road. So that such changes in the way that you design and construct a road can become part of the guidelines and the procedures that contractors are using when building and maintaining roads. And through that type of information, you change the policy in making sure that we don't just use older models, older understanding of our materials, our transportation needs, of the effects of logistics on transportation, but that we really use current knowledge, current data, and changes that happens. I mean, we all hear about things like autonomous vehicles and electrical vehicles. We hear about Internet of Things, small devices, all of this data getting together. And the idea is to provide the background and the support so that the policy can be based on current and good information that's applicable to South Africa.
Now, I do remember seeing loads and loads of goods piled atop a whole line, or a 3-day-long line of trucks headed out of the country for Beitbridge when the lockdown eased, to ease the route into the heart of the continent. What kind of pressure does that kind of logistical bottleneck put on the roads?
On the road itself, the bottleneck is not that much of an effect because it's the same load that you still put on the road. The big effect in that case is actually the produce and the goods that's on those vehicles. And especially if we are looking at our agricultural sector and you export agricultural products. And you can think for yourself, if you've got a truckload of tomatoes or avocados or potatoes sitting on that truck for 3 days, through the day, through the night, the quality of that produce is going down. And the reason why that is important for the country is as the quality goes down, the price that you get for that product drops. So therefore, the income for the farming community drops. And in our rural areas, that's a significant effect on their economy. And that's why it's not always just the infrastructure that gets damaged, but it's whatever is transported into that system. That's where a major effect also sits. And we have to look at the whole picture to solve that, and not just one or two of the small aspects and try to have a bit of a short fix.
Now imagine that you and your colleagues are sitting and gazing into the looking glass, looking into the future, and you're seeing the driverless cars and in the smart cities of the future. But that's all that we have time for tonight. Thank you, most appreciated. Thanks for joining us tonight. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the opportunity.
Well, that's how we come to the very end of Economics Unbound tonight.